Let me bring in my colleague, Vaughn Hilliard, who's at the White House for us. Vaughn, what can you fill in for us about how the day unfolded?
Nicole, there's a lot of unanswered questions. It was just 24 hours ago that I was on a tarmac in New Jersey outside of his Bedminster Golf Club when I asked the president very explicitly whether the U.S. had intelligence that Iran was actively building a nuclear weapon. And he told me that his intelligence community and Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who notably you did not see standing behind him there at the White House delivering these remarks, that their assessments that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, that at least the U.S. had no intelligence of that, was, quote, wrong. I asked him whether he believed that Israel would be able to take out these nuclear facilities on its own, like Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu repeated 2 different times over the last 48 hours. And he undercut that assessment from the Israeli Prime Minister, suggesting that the U.S. was the only one that had the capacity to effectively, especially in the case of Fordo, which has this underground nuclear facility a half a mile under the ground, be able to adequately drop a bomb that would be able to take out this nuclear facility. And while he opened the door to this idea of 2 weeks, he never said that he was going to give 2 weeks to Iran to come back to the negotiating table over a potential nuclear agreement, notably one that he and his first administration pulled out back in 2018. But here today, in striking fashion, deciding to use the U.S. military in an offensive fashion within Iran, despite just 24 hours ago, again, the Iranian foreign minister, in an interview with our colleague Andrea Mitchell, making it clear that Iran was still interested in negotiating a potential deal where they would be able to enrich a certain level of uranium. Clearly, the president, after 2 months of negotiations, dismissing those overtures and deciding to move forward with these airstrikes, Nicole.
Vaughn, let me ask you if you have any reporting that explains what he is referring to when the president says if peace doesn't come quickly, then, I mean, he seems to be threatening further American involvement in attacks on Iran, or is that something the White House might describe as, I don't know, part of his deal making? What do we know what the further threat is to Iran?
The president has said that boots on the ground would be a last resort, that is not his plan. He noted tonight that there are no exact plans of further aggression inside of Iran, that these were the end of the initial airstrikes. It's now up to Iran to come to, again, a nuclear negotiating table here. But for the president here, I think that this is worth noting that we've had a conversation over this idea of a 2-week timeline, right? It was 3 weeks ago that he suggested there would be consequences for Russia if it didn't agree to a ceasefire agreement or a peace deal with Ukraine. And that deadline came and went. Of course, the president in his first administration threatened to strike and blow up North Korea. He has threatened repeatedly to strike and blow up Iran. And this here, I think, is notable because these are the most significant offensive strikes we have seen the president move forward with since he killed Iranian military general Soleimani back in 2020. And I think it's important for folks to remember in retaliation, which Iran has threatened to do this time around, Iran launched airstrikes at a U.S. air base in Iraq. And more than 100 service personnel ultimately walked away with traumatic brain injuries. And there is still that looming threat here of how Iran is going to potentially retaliate against the U.S. The president making clear that they should not, and that he is prepared and equipped to use the U.S. military again to further activate troops in an offensive manner within Iran.
Vaughn, stick around for us. I want to bring into our coverage NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley. We heard from Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu before. We heard from Donald Trump. What did he have to say?
Yeah, well, Nicole, I mean, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu couldn't have been more pleased with President Trump. His very brief remarks in English were filled with superlatives and just in a palpable sense of joy at what President Trump had done. And it was actually extraordinary to see just how grateful Prime Minister Netanyahu was in such a public way. He said, America has been truly surpassed. It has done what no other country on earth could do. He said that President Trump in the United States acted with a lot of strength. He said, President Trump, I thank you. The people of Israel thank you. The forces of civilization thank you. And then he did God bless America, God bless Israel. It was very much just a totally dedicated speech to praising the president. And this is very interesting because remember, Nicole, just a couple of months ago, it looked as though President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu were kind of on the outs. President Trump was negotiating with Iran, something that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has constantly said he doesn't want to see negotiations with Iran. The president made a very high-profile visit to the Middle East and didn't visit Israel, America's top ally in the Middle East, one of its top allies in the world. So it looked as though the president and Netanyahu weren't going to be the best friends that everybody had imagined during the Biden years, when it looked as though Biden was very much falling out with Netanyahu. Now, President Trump seems to have sort of tethered himself, not just to Netanyahu, but to his adventures throughout the entire Middle East. And that could become very, very dangerous. You know, President Trump did mention Qasem Soleimani in that speech. Qasem Soleimani was the head of the Quds Force, who President Trump had assassinated back in 2020. Much of the defense and security and intelligence establishment were telling President Trump that this is going to be a bad idea, that there's going to be blowback, that the Iranians will attack America. Well, they didn't really. There wasn't really that much blowback. A previous strike that the U.S. did against the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria back in 2017 under President Trump's direction, that also didn't have the same kind of blowback that a lot of people were worried about. It's quite likely that President Trump remembered all of those warnings and how they didn't come true. He may believe that he can stroll into the ring, make a few quick punches, and walk out a champ. And it's unclear whether or not that's going to happen because Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be, on some level, held to the notion that if you break it, you buy it, basically. This is what happened to the U.S. in Iraq, the invasion and the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime that caused so much instability, not just in Iraq, but in neighboring countries as well, for decades. Now you're going to be seeing something like this in Iran, as we hear the conversation here in Israel among the top-level politicians increasingly has shifted from destroying Iran's nuclear program to affecting regime change in Iran, which we, as Americans, know that is a very troubling concept of regime change. It's been very frustrating for previous U.S. presidents before President Trump. But with this mentality now, if President Trump believes that he can just walk away from this situation, that's quite possible. But we have to see what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose very warm words for the president today, must have cheered President Trump. We'll have to see what Netanyahu decides to do next.
Matt, did Prime Minister Netanyahu convey any surprise, or did it seem obvious and preordained that Donald Trump would do what he did tonight?
I would say it didn't look as though he was expressing surprise, but it came very, very quickly after the president's strikes. And I would say that Prime Minister Netanyahu's body language was, again, as I said, palpably almost excited. He almost seemed to be jumping up and down. It was that pleased. And again, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made a big point of telling the Israeli public that he and only he can extract or wring out concessions from Washington. He makes it very clear that through successive presidents and leaders in the United States, that Netanyahu is the man for getting the United States to do what Israel wants. He's made this very public, and a lot of Israelis that I talked to believe this. There was this expectation that the president would weigh in with Israel. Driving down the highway the other day, I saw a bunch of big highway signs, big billboards saying, "Finish the job, Mr. President," with a big American flag and a picture of President Trump. This is something that people are putting on billboards. And it was very much a strong feeling that the president should weigh in to help Israel. And this is what we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu tonight. There was gratitude, there was excitement, there was a sense of relief for the prime minister, who definitely instigated this war with Iran and now could be held accountable if he doesn't succeed in his stated goals. But there was also this sense that the prime minister really did feel as though he might owe something to President Trump. You could tell that the gratitude was so deep. And again, this is something that's going to vindicate Netanyahu in front of the Israeli public, as he has been increasingly blamed for the failures of October 7th. Now, with this latest adventure into Iran, it looks as though Prime Minister Netanyahu can turn to the Israeli public and say, I have done what everybody said was a terrible idea for generations. The United States government has regularly been telling Netanyahu, who, by the way, has been pushing for destroying Iran's nuclear program since the early 1990s. The U.S. and other leaders have always been telling them, don't do it. Step away from the brink. Don't attack Iran. Well, Israel did, and over the past week, its military dominance in Iran has been unquestionable. It is almost, again, when you talk to Israeli officials, they're extremely and visibly pleased with how well this attack on Iran has done. It has a popularity rate here in Israel, according to a most recent poll, of over 80% among Jewish Israelis. So this was a very popular move, and bringing President Trump on board is going to carry huge rewards for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But President Trump and his followers are going to have to ask, and they're already asking, what are the rewards for the United States?
Matt Bradley, incredible reporting. Thank you so much. Stay close to the camera. We're grateful to get to talk to you tonight.